I'm a 29-year-old woman, and for as long as I can remember, my mother has believed I was in a lifelong competition I never agreed to enter. The other contestant was Rebecca, my mom's best friend Diane's daughter, who's a year older than me. If I got an A, Rebecca had already gotten an A+. If I got promoted, Rebecca had been promoted months earlier. It didn't matter what I did. Somehow, Rebecca had always done it first, better, or with more grace. Growing up, every celebration came with a footnote. When I graduated college, Mom smiled for the photos but mentioned that Rebecca had graduated with honors. When I bought my first car, she said Rebecca's was hybrid and so responsible. Even when I moved into my own apartment, she told me how Rebecca's place had crown molding and a balcony. It was never said cruelly, just constantly, like breathing. Mom always insisted she was just motivating me. She'd tell her friends she raised me to be ambitious, but the truth was that her compliments felt like reports she was sending to Diane. My father, Mark, tried to stay out of it. He'd hum or change the subject whenever comparisons started, but silence can be its own kind of agreement. Rebecca grew into the kind of person people called effortless. She became a lifestyle consultant, whatever that means, posting pictures of minimalist kitchens, designer outfits, and self-care quotes written in perfect cursive. Mom followed all of it religiously. Every new post was another reminder that Rebecca had become the woman my mother always wanted me to be. Family dinners were the worst. Mom and Diane would spend hours trading updates about their daughters. Except Diane's updates made Mom glow with pride, while mine made her smile politely before circling back to Rebecca's discipline or confidence. If I brought dessert, she'd say Rebecca's baking looked more professional. If I mentioned a new client at work, she'd ask if it was as big as Rebecca's projects. Eventually, I started visiting less. Every phone call became another evaluation, another chance to hear what I wasn't. I told myself distance was peace, but it only muted the noise. It didn't stop it. Then came the lunch that changed everything. We were at our usual cafe when Mom leaned back, smiling, and said, "Did you hear? Rebecca's engaged. To a doctor. Isn't that wonderful? Maybe you'll get there one day." She laughed like it was a harmless joke. I didn't. Something in me just stopped. I realized that no achievement, no milestone would ever be enough unless it mirrored Rebecca's. A few weeks later, one of my corporate clients hired me to plan a high-end dinner event. I spent weeks perfecting every detail. The seating, the lighting, the food presentation. When it ended successfully, a strange thought crossed my mind. What if I hosted my own dinner? Not for work, not for show, something personal. The idea grew quickly. A dinner at my apartment, just intimate enough to feel casual but structured enough that Mom couldn't critique it without sounding petty. I'd invite her, Dad, Diane, and of course Rebecca. On the surface, it would look like an attempt to reconnect. In reality, it would be something else entirely, a quiet experiment. I wanted to see what happened when perfection had to sit across from authenticity, when carefully staged smiles met reality without filters or scripts. Not to embarrass anyone, not to win, but to finally end the unspoken contest. I started planning in secret. I picked the date, the menu, the theme. I told myself this wasn't revenge, it was balance. Mom thought she was walking into another night where Rebecca's light would outshine mine. She had no idea that this time, I wasn't competing, I was hosting. By the time the invitations were sent, everything was ready. The food, the decor, the calm tone I practiced in front of the mirror. I didn't want drama, I wanted truth. I had no idea then how much one dinner could change decades of comparisons, or how quiet the room would get when perfect finally cracked. I called my mom on a Thursday morning, keeping my voice casual. I told her I was hosting a dinner at my apartment the following weekend, and that she and Dad were invited. I added that Diane and Rebecca would be there too. There was a sharp pause before she spoke again, the kind of pause that means she's already grinning. She said that was a lovely idea, and that Rebecca would love giving me a few pointers on how to host properly. I could almost hear her standing taller through the phone, probably imagining how she'd tell Diane later that her daughter was finally stepping up. I ended the call quickly, pretending I had work to get back to. 10 minutes later, my dad texted asking if I was sure about this. I replied with 2 words. It's time. He didn't push further. I spent that night outlining everything. The theme would be a seasonal tasting menu, something elegant but warm, sophisticated without showing off. I wanted it to look effortless. No flashy centerpieces, no overdone plating. I wanted the kind of calm precision that made noise look cheap. My apartment became a small workshop over the next few days. I rented extra seating, picked candles that smelled faintly of amber and citrus, and tested lighting that softened everything. My chef friend Ethan stopped by and offered to help with plating and timing. He'd worked corporate events with me before and knew how I liked things. Clean lines, quiet elegance, no chaos visible to guests. The guest list stayed the same. Mom, Dad, Diane, and Rebecca. 4 people, 4 different versions of perfect. I called Diane next. I used my professional voice, the one I use when convincing clients that I have everything under control. I said it had been too long and we should all reconnect. She sounded thrilled, already talking about bringing a bottle of wine. I didn't need to ask which kind. Diane never shows up without something expensive. Within an hour, a group text appeared. Diane wrote, "So excited for Saturday," and Rebecca followed with an overly cheerful, "Can't wait," complete with double exclamation marks and a sparkle emoji. It read like a commercial script, not enthusiasm. Mom replied last, telling everyone she'd make sure Ava feels comfortable hosting such accomplished women. The next few days were a countdown of unsolicited advice. Mom called every evening asking about the menu, my outfit, and my table settings. She suggested I keep my makeup classic and reminded me not to seem nervous around Rebecca, who just has a natural presence. Every conversation was another reminder that this dinner wasn't just social, it was her scoreboard. I didn't argue. I focused on preparation. I created a seating chart where Mom would sit directly across from Rebecca, leaving Diane and Dad at the sides. The symmetry was intentional. It would let comparisons happen naturally, without me saying a word. I selected music that blended into the background and planned conversation topics about work, travel, and real success outside of appearances. Subtle traps, not confrontations. Meanwhile, information trickled in through quiet channels. One of my old clients mentioned Rebecca's name when talking about a brand campaign. She lowered her voice and said the company had worked with Rebecca once, but didn't renew her contract because she'd exaggerated her credentials. Later that week, I heard from a mutual friend that Rebecca's engagement had ended weeks ago, though her social media still showed smiling couple photos. Every caption was past tense, pretending to be present. By Friday, my apartment was spotless. Every glass shined, the linen napkins were pressed. I even borrowed a few serving dishes from my catering supplier. Nothing showy, just high-end enough to make subtle impact. I spent that night rehearsing small details. When to pour the wine, when to steer conversation, when to let silence stretch. Saturday evening arrived like a slow drumbeat. At 6 sharp, the doorbell rang. Mom and Dad were early, of course. Mom stepped in wearing pearls, her eyes darting immediately to every corner of the apartment. She touched the napkins, adjusted a candle, and nodded approvingly like an inspector signing off a checklist. Dad gave me a quiet smile and handed over a bottle of red wine he probably didn't pick himself. Mom walked around commenting on the lighting, the scent, even the background music. She said it felt elegant, not like your usual setups. I let her wander. Every compliment sounded like surprise, as if she didn't think I was capable of refinement without a guidebook. At 6:30, the second knock came. Diane entered in a coral dress, an air of practiced warmth. She hugged Mom first, then looked around the apartment with bright approval. She praised everything from the aroma to the placement of the plates, already announcing that Rebecca will love this. I was refilling glasses when the elevator dinged again. The hallway fell quiet before I even reached the door. Rebecca stepped in, dressed in a fitted cream outfit that looked straight from a magazine. Her hair was perfect, her perfume soft but noticeable, her smile professional. She handed me a small bouquet and complimented the space before even looking around. Her eyes flicked across the room in calculated rhythm. Walls, table, guests, herself in reflection. For a moment, the air felt charged. Mom's face glowed with pride. She seemed convinced the evening was about to become another chapter in her ongoing campaign for Rebecca's perfection. Diane's chatter filled the gap, and Dad poured wine like a peacekeeper. Rebecca took her seat exactly as I expected, across from Mom, angled slightly toward the light. Her posture was flawless. Her tone was breezy. But there was a stiffness, a layer too polished to be natural. I walked back to the kitchen, adjusted a plate, and caught a glimpse of the reflection in the glass door. 4 guests sat around my table, each pretending not to measure the others. The stage was set exactly how I wanted. The performance was about to begin. Dinner started like a performance everyone had rehearsed. Rebecca complimented the decor in that light, polished tone that fills space without warmth. Mom beamed across the table, already turning the compliment into her own validation, saying she always told me to add a woman's touch to my apartment. The first course came out on small plates, pumpkin bisque with toasted seeds. The chef friend I'd hired worked silently in the kitchen, moving like a ghost while I carried plates to the table. Rebecca photographed her bowl before lifting the spoon. Mom leaned forward to mention how Rebecca's clients would love this kind of presentation. The conversation unfolded like a tug-of-war wrapped in politeness. Diane praised the food. Mom redirected attention toward Rebecca's latest global clients, and Rebecca talked about her consulting firm in the city. Her words sounded memorized, each sentence rehearsed for admiration. Mark asked casual questions about her fiancé, the doctor. The pause that followed was brief but sharp. Rebecca stirred her soup and said he was traveling for work, then immediately changed the subject to business growth. Mom nodded too eagerly, pretending not to notice the hesitation. As plates cleared, I guided the next topic toward what success meant outside of image. I mentioned one of my recent events, a charity fundraiser that prioritized local artisans over luxury sponsors. Diane said that sounded refreshing. Mom jumped in, explaining how Rebecca always says branding is everything. Rebecca smiled thinly, nodding like someone used to being quoted. Her eyes flicked to me for the first time with a quick, unreadable glance. The second course followed, grilled sea bass with citrus glaze. The table quieted except for soft clinking. Diane complimented the flavor. Mom asked if I'd really made it myself. When I said yes, she laughed lightly and said it looked too professional to be homemade. That was when the rhythm of the evening shifted. Diane, clearly unaware of what she was about to start, asked when Rebecca was moving in with her fiancé. The question landed like a dropped glass. Rebecca froze, then smiled a little too wide, saying plans had changed due to career transitions. Mom's hand twitched against her napkin. I let a small silence stretch before speaking. I mentioned that one of my clients used to employ Rebecca's firm but had decided not to renew because of a branding mismatch. I didn't elaborate. I just poured more wine and passed the bread. No one spoke for several seconds. Diane blinked in surprise. Mark studied his plate. Mom's eyes flicked from Rebecca to me, then back again. Rebecca gave a short laugh, saying there were always creative differences in business, but her tone cracked at the edges. The tension didn't burst, it simmered. Diane tried to steer the conversation toward travel, but her sentences wandered. Rebecca excused herself to the restroom soon after. The moment she left, Mom leaned forward, lowering her voice to ask if I knew about the breakup. She tried to sound casual, but her voice trembled. I didn't answer. Rebecca returned minutes later with a fresh layer of calm, sitting straighter than before. She complimented the dessert presentation, a light pear tart drizzled with honey. I thanked her, and we all pretended the room wasn't vibrating with unspoken things. When the last course ended, conversation grew thinner. The clock ticked louder than the music. Mom looked unusually quiet, sipping her wine instead of redirecting the spotlight. Diane filled the silence with safe stories about gardening and neighbors. As coffee was served, Rebecca started talking about self-discipline and how imperfections build character. It was the kind of line that would have played well online but sounded hollow at that table. Mom smiled faintly but didn't echo her. Mark nodded politely, saying nothing. When the evening finally wound down, coats were gathered, hugs exchanged. Mom thanked me for hosting in a soft tone I didn't recognize. Diane complimented the food again, then whispered that Rebecca had been off her game lately. At the door, Rebecca gave me that perfect smile again, the kind that looks good in photos but doesn't touch the eyes. She said it was a lovely night, and I told her I was glad she came. She held my gaze for a second longer than expected before leaving. After the elevator doors closed, Mom stood in the hallway for a moment before stepping back in to grab the dish she'd brought. She glanced around my apartment again, slower this time, and said it looked grown up. Then she left without another word. When the door shut behind her, the apartment went still. The candles had burned low. A single fork clinked softly in the sink as the chef loaded dishes. The tension that had filled every corner of the room hung there for a moment longer before fading. From the balcony, I could see their car headlights pull away, Mom in the passenger seat, head turned toward the window, Diane's car following close behind. The night ended not with arguments or raised voices, but with a silence that carried more weight than anything spoken. It wasn't the kind of silence that asks for explanation. It was the kind that settles when pretense runs out, when every polished word has already done its job and failed. The next morning, sunlight came through the blinds before my phone started buzzing. Mom had called 3 times. The voicemail was short, her tone careful, almost restrained. I didn't call back. Instead, I made coffee, opened the windows, and let the quiet fill the space that had been crowded with voices the night before. An hour later, there was a knock on my door. Dad stood outside holding a small bag of pastries. He said he'd been in the area and wanted to drop them off. I stepped aside to let him in, and he looked around as if expecting Mom to appear behind him. When she didn't, he exhaled and said she hadn't talked much on the way home. He called it the quietest drive of his life. He stayed for coffee and said the dinner had been something else. He didn't elaborate, but his half-smile said enough. Before leaving, he told me to give Mom time, words that sounded more like habit than hope. By afternoon, messages started trickling in from family friends. Diane's cousin texted to ask if everything was okay because Diane had mentioned tension at my dinner. Then someone else wrote that Rebecca didn't seem herself. It was clear that stories were already moving. Around 5, my doorbell rang again. Mom stood there holding a serving dish she claimed she forgot the night before. She walked in without waiting for an answer, looking around as if expecting evidence of a disaster. The same candles from the dinner still sat unlit on the counter. She started talking immediately, complimenting the food again, then shifting to small talk about her neighbor's dog, as though pretending nothing had happened. Every few sentences she paused, waiting for me to join in. I didn't. She filled the silence with half sentences about Rebecca being probably tired and under a lot of stress. When she finally ran out of filler, she sighed and looked toward the balcony. She said things had gotten a little awkward last night, but insisted Rebecca was just going through a hard patch. I told her everyone has moments when pretending gets heavy. The sentence hung there between us. She adjusted her purse strap and nodded slowly, like someone hearing a language she didn't understand. The conversation shifted to trivial things, flowers, curtains, paint color, but none of it landed. She seemed smaller somehow, less certain about which role to play. When she finally said she had to go, she placed the dish down gently, said she'd check in later, and left without another word. That evening, my phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Diane. She thanked me for hosting and said the night had been eye-opening. She ended with, "Rebecca's dealing with more than she lets on." I didn't reply. 2 days later, Dad called. He said Mom had been unusually quiet. She'd spent an hour cleaning the kitchen that didn't need cleaning. When he asked if she was okay, she'd brushed it off and gone for a long walk. He said he hadn't seen her like that before. By the weekend, the small ripples from the dinner had turned into whispers. Diane's social circle was buzzing with speculation about Rebecca's fiancé, her clients, her future. None of it came from me, but people were connecting dots on their own. At work, I buried myself in back-to-back projects. My assistant mentioned seeing Rebecca's name tagged in a vague post about starting over. The caption read, "Everything happens for a reason." It had that same polished tone, but the comments were fewer than usual. On Sunday afternoon, Dad stopped by again. He said Mom wanted to come but decided against it. He called it progress. He stayed long enough to tell me she'd spent the morning on the phone with Diane. Apparently, Rebecca had canceled a speaking engagement last minute. Diane told Mom she was reevaluating everything. Later that evening, Mom texted me. Just a single sentence. "Dinner was lovely, even if it didn't go as planned." I reread it twice. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't denial either. That night, I met Ethan, my chef friend, for a late coffee. He mentioned that 2 of his contacts who'd been at a networking event earlier that week said Rebecca's name came up. Someone had mentioned branding inconsistencies in her company. It was spreading quietly, not maliciously, just fact replacing myth. Over the next few days, Mom's calls became shorter and less controlling. Instead of her usual advice, she asked simple questions about work and recipes. Her voice lacked the edge it usually carried. When she hung up, it always ended with a pause, like she wanted to say more but didn't know how. One evening, I got a message from Diane again. She said Rebecca had taken some time off and was reconsidering her direction. She added that she appreciated my grace during dinner. The words sat strangely in the text, but I knew what she meant. I scrolled through Rebecca's feed later that night. The engagement ring was gone from photos, the captions were neutral, the filters dimmer. Her page looked less like a brand and more like a person trying to remember what to post without an audience. Mom called again the next morning. She asked if I wanted to meet for lunch next week. Her voice soft, unsure. I said yes. Not out of forgiveness or obligation, just because I knew this time she wasn't calling to compare me to anyone. When we hung up, I looked around my apartment. The candles from the dinner still sat untouched on the shelf. They had burned long enough to change something. Not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to make the air feel different. And somewhere between those quiet calls, the silence that used to sit heavy between us began to sound a little less like distance and a little more like space. Within a few weeks, word quietly spread that Rebecca's engagement had officially ended. Diane called it mutual, but everyone knew better. The wedding website disappeared overnight, and her fiancé's photos vanished from every platform. It wasn't scandalous, just silent. The kind of silence people fill with their own versions of the story. At home, Mom's usual chatter about Rebecca stopped without warning. She'd still call me sometimes, but the conversations were shorter. For the first time in my life, she could talk for 20 minutes without mentioning Rebecca's name. The absence of comparison felt strange, unnatural, like a missing background noise. The shift showed itself fully at my aunt's birthday dinner a week later. My extended family filled the restaurant with noise and half-overlapping conversations. At one point, my cousin mentioned seeing Rebecca's old company listed as under restructuring. Mom froze mid-bite, then quickly turned the topic to my latest event project. She described my work with more detail than I'd ever heard her use before. Almost too much detail, like she was trying to memorize what pride sounded like. The compliments came out stiff, uneven, but they were real. Over the next days, her tone stayed lighter. Instead of Rebecca did something similar, it became you've always been creative. I didn't correct her or question it. I just let it happen. Then Diane called and invited us all to a small barbecue at her place, just to reconnect. It sounded harmless enough, though I could hear the forced brightness in her voice. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity. That Saturday, the air was warm, the backyard trimmed and decorated with string lights that turned on as the sun dipped. Diane greeted us like nothing had changed, hugging Mom with practiced warmth. Rebecca stood by the patio table, wearing jeans and a simple linen blouse. No designer labels, no polished edges. She looked lighter and older at the same time. Mom hesitated before greeting her, unsure which version of Rebecca to address. Rebecca smiled faintly and complimented the flowers, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Diane, however, filled every silence with her own nervous energy, bragging about how strong Rebecca was being and how she was turning everything around. It was an odd reversal, Diane performing the same pride routine Mom used to, while Mom listened quietly, nodding instead of competing. Rebecca's polite half-smiles made it clear she'd heard those same speeches 100 times before. As people gathered near the grill, Rebecca eventually made her way toward me. She stood close enough that I could smell the faint trace of coffee on her breath. She said the dinner I hosted had been handled with grace. I told her everyone learns lessons at their own pace. She nodded, and for a moment there was no tension, just a strange mutual understanding. The words must have carried farther than I thought. Across the yard, Mom's hand stilled mid-motion as she set down a drink. She didn't speak for the rest of the evening. When the gathering ended, Diane hugged everyone at the door, thanking us for staying connected. On the drive home, Dad later told me, Mom stared out the window the entire ride, quiet except for one sentence, something about wondering where things had gone wrong. That week, she called me more than usual, once to ask about a new recipe, once to talk about her garden, and then one evening, her voice changed. She said she'd been thinking, and that maybe she'd focused on the wrong things. Her tone wasn't dramatic or heavy, just plain, like a confession said to herself as much as to me. I told her love doesn't have to compare anyone. She went silent, then said she understood. No arguing, no justification. The next weekend, she came over with groceries, not to inspect my apartment, but to cook together. There were no remarks about Rebecca, no corrections about seasoning or style. She just chopped vegetables and asked about my clients, listening like it was something new she'd discovered she could do. We ate quietly at the counter. Between bites, she said she'd spoken to Diane again, that Rebecca might be moving out of the city for a while. She didn't say why, only that Diane sounded relieved. After she left, I stood in the same apartment where all of this had started, the same walls that once felt like a stage. The comparisons, the silence, the dinner, they had rearranged something invisible. It wasn't about winning or proving anymore. That night, Mom sent me a text before bed. Proud of you. For everything. No footnotes, no names attached. It was short, awkward, and perfect in its simplicity. For the first time, silence didn't feel like something missing. It felt like peace settling exactly where it belonged. A week after the barbecue, Diane called and asked to meet for coffee. Her voice was lower than usual, missing the polished excitement she normally carried. She said she owed me some honesty. We met at a small cafe halfway between our offices. She arrived early, sitting by the window with her phone face down. When I walked in, she stood up quickly, like she'd been waiting for the moment to get over with. Once we sat down, she didn't waste time. She said Rebecca's business was in trouble. Serious trouble. Contracts had been canceled. Bills were piling up, and her former partners had quietly stepped away. The engagement, Diane explained, ended after Rebecca fabricated a partnership online to make it look like she was expanding internationally. The truth came out when her fiancé confronted her about a fake press release she'd written herself. Diane rubbed her temples, saying she'd only found out when creditors began calling the house. She admitted she'd spent years convincing herself Rebecca was unstoppable, even when she saw cracks forming. I raised her to perform, she said, not to live. For a long time, we just sat there listening to the cafe hum around us. The sound of cups clinking, doors opening, people talking about normal things. Then Diane said something that caught me off guard. She told me the dinner I'd hosted had been the first time she'd seen someone handle truth without tearing anyone down. That it made her realize strength wasn't loud, it was steady. When we left, she hugged me tightly and told me to take care of my mother. Her tone made it clear she'd already told Linda everything. That evening, there was another knock on my door. Mom stood there holding a small container of soup, her usual excuse when she didn't know how to start a conversation. She stepped inside quietly. There were no critiques about the lighting or my decor this time. She set the container on the counter and said she'd spoken to Diane. Then she just stood there, hands clasped. Her voice was soft when she said she finally understood how much she'd contributed to the problem. She admitted she'd spent most of her life feeling overshadowed by Diane, by her confidence, her social ease, her ability to make everything seem effortless. She said that when Rebecca started excelling, she saw it as proof Diane had done something right that she hadn't. She wanted me to have that same glow of pride attached to her name, even if it meant pushing me into a race I didn't sign up for. Her words weren't emotional or rehearsed. They sounded like someone finally setting something heavy down. I didn't interrupt her. I let her talk until the room grew quiet again. Then I told her she didn't owe me an apology, only a promise that the comparisons would stop. She nodded and said she was proud of me. Not as a reflex, not to fill silence, but as a fact. A few weeks later, I heard through one of my clients that Rebecca had moved out of the city. She'd taken a small job in a coastal town, teaching design workshops and avoiding cameras. Someone said she looked happier. I believed it. Time passed quietly after that. Work stayed busy. My event firm landed a corporate contract for a major tech company's annual gala. It was the biggest project I'd ever managed. Invitations went out across the city, and to my surprise, Mom asked if she could come. I didn't hesitate before saying yes. The night of the event, the ballroom glowed with amber lights and mirrored tables. Guests mingled under soft jazz and flashes of camera bulbs. Mom arrived with Dad, both dressed elegantly but understated. She moved through the room carefully, introducing herself to people I worked with, smiling like she was proud just to be part of it. When the magazine photographer asked for a few pictures, she stood beside me, arm linked with mine. A few days later, the event made it to the local lifestyle pages with a small write-up, praising the coordination and design. The photo showed Mom and me standing together near the floral display, both of us mid-laugh. At the next family gathering, Diane brought a copy of the article. She showed everyone the photo, pointing out how natural we looked together. Mom laughed quietly, brushing off the attention, but there was pride in her eyes. Real pride, the kind that didn't need comparison to exist. Later that evening, she introduced me to someone new who'd asked about event planning. She said, "This is my daughter, the best in her field." It wasn't boastful, it wasn't defensive, it was simple, certain, and true. When everyone left and the room emptied, I helped her collect dishes and straighten the chairs. She didn't offer advice or corrections. Instead, she turned to me and said, "You did what I never could. You ended the cycle." Then she smiled and walked out to the car. The world didn't change overnight. People still whispered, families still compared, but it didn't matter anymore. That dinner months ago had started as a quiet act of defiance. It ended up being something else entirely, a reset. What it exposed wasn't just Rebecca's illusion, but the years of silent competition between two women who measured their worth through their daughters. Now every time Mom visits, she brings dessert instead of expectations. And for the first time, when she looks at me, she sees me, not who I should have been. Almost a year passed after the dinner that changed everything. Life moved at a quiet, steady rhythm. My event firm grew, my weekends stayed calm, and conversations with my parents no longer carried the tension they once did. The air between us had softened. Mom still visited now and then, never unannounced anymore. She'd bring flowers or a new recipe she wanted to try. Sometimes she'd compliment my cooking, or mention how peaceful my apartment felt. Occasionally, the old reflex would flicker. Her eyes would linger on something I owned, a tone creeping into her voice as if a comparison was waiting to surface. But she caught herself every time. Dad said she practiced it. He told me she'd pause mid-sentence, smile, and redirect. "She's learning," he said once, just slower than most. Through him, I also heard updates about Diane and Rebecca. Rebecca had moved to a smaller city by the coast. She was running design workshops, no longer using her social media as a portfolio of perfection. People said she looked happier, healthier, and less rehearsed. Diane had shifted her own focus. She'd joined a local charity and started mentoring young women in business. The photos she shared online now showed community projects instead of luxury brunches. By early spring, my firm landed its biggest opportunity yet, a high-profile charity gala hosted by a regional foundation. It was the kind of event that could attract sponsors and open doors for national clients. I threw myself into the planning, not for recognition, but because it felt good to create something meaningful from scratch. A week before the event, Mom called. Her tone was cheerful as she talked about Diane possibly attending. Then she added, "I just hope you won't feel overshadowed." The words slipped out like muscle memory. For a moment, there was silence. Then I told her simply that I didn't compete with anyone anymore. I was proud of what I'd built. She hesitated, realizing what she'd said, and replied softly that she didn't mean it like that. I told her I knew. We left it there, no lecture, no correction. Sometimes silence is enough to show growth. The night of the gala arrived crisp and cool. The venue glowed under soft lighting, gold table settings reflecting the chandeliers above. Staff moved seamlessly, the band played smooth instrumentals, and everything ran like a quiet symphony. I checked the details one last time before stepping back to watch it all unfold. When the first guests arrived, I greeted sponsors, city officials, and clients. Then I spotted Diane walking in with a modest clutch and a genuine smile. She hugged me and said the night was beautiful, that I'd reminded her what authenticity looks like. It didn't sound like flattery, it sounded earned. Mom stood a few steps behind, watching. She didn't interrupt, didn't try to join the conversation. Her expression carried something I hadn't seen before, pride without tension. When Diane walked away, Mom just nodded toward me with quiet approval. Later in the evening, as speeches ended and guests mingled, Dad leaned over with a grin. Funny, isn't it? Your mother used to compare you to Diane. Now Diane compares her daughter to you. He said it under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear, and walked off before I could respond. I caught Mom glancing across the room again, not at Rebecca, not at Diane, but at me. Just me. She looked content, settled, as if the competition she'd once lived by had finally lost its power. As the event wrapped up, she helped hand out thank you gifts to departing guests. Near the end of the night, when the room was half empty, she turned to me and said something simple. I thought I was helping you aim higher. I didn't see I was just pushing you away. There was no emotion behind it, just truth. I told her we couldn't change the past, but we could keep this peace going forward. She nodded and gave a small, tired smile, the kind that said she meant it. After everyone left, I stayed behind as the staff cleared tables. The chandeliers dimmed one by one, and the room shifted from lively to still. I walked across the empty floor, heels clicking softly, and looked around at what remained. Faded candlelight, scattered petals, a quiet kind of aftermath. It struck me then how far things had come. A year earlier, dinner had been a battleground of comparisons and quiet resentments. Now it was just life, steady, earned, and peaceful. When I turned off the last light, the reflection in the glass doors showed no audience, no rivalries, no expectations, just me, standing in the space I built. The dinner that once exposed everything wrong between us had ended up revealing everything that could still be right. And for the first time, success didn't need to look perfect. It just needed to feel real.